Today we're going to be taking a look at a 2024 Election Day map prediction. In my previous video, I covered Harris versus Trump based on the polls. However, I did not take into effect the third-party candidate, RFK Jr. RFK Jr. has emerged as a viable third-party candidate who won't necessarily per se win the election, but can have an impact in some of the key battleground states. Harris's increase in popularity in her selection of Governor of Minnesota Tim Walz as her VP pick, does RFK Jr. help or hurt Harris in the electoral college battleground states? Let's go to the map to find out. Alright guys, quick sign up before I start the video. There's this weird snapping sound you'll hear in the video. I promise that's not me. I'm not sure what's going on. I think when I was recording it, my iPad was somehow doing something. I'm not exactly sure, but just try to ignore that sound. Also, I say Joe Biden is up when of course he's not running. What I meant to say was he was currently at that time pulling ahead or behind Trump. So yeah, I just want to get those two things out of the way, and yeah, let's continue with the video. Let's first start in Maine, where one poll has Harris up by 8, with RFK Jr. snagging 4% of the vote. This is a likely state for Harris, and also the 2nd district goes to Trump, and the 1st district safely goes to Harris. Now let's go to New Hampshire, where a recent poll shows Harris up by 7, with RFK Jr. grabbing 6% of the vote. This is a likely state for Harris. I think Harris's margin in New Hampshire will be a tiny bit smaller than that. However, it's not insane, so I'll put it as likely. We have not had any Vermont polling, but as you guys know, it's a safe state. We haven't had any Massachusetts polling with Kamala Harris, but as you guys know, this is a safe state. But one interesting thing, as RFK Jr. significantly gets in the high single digits in Massachusetts, so RFK Jr. has some support there. Again, in Rhode Island, we don't have any recent polling, but the most recent poll has Joe Biden up by only 7. Yeah, that's not going to happen. So I'm just going to put it as a safe state. They have RFK Jr. with 12% of the vote. Now, we can just Washington, D.C. out of the way. That's the most Democratic state in the country. Now let's go to Maryland. Again, we don't have really any recent polling, but not surprisingly, Joe Biden is up, with RFK Jr. grabbing 6% of the vote. Now let's go to New Jersey, a somewhat interesting state. Joe Biden won it by over 14 points in the 2020 election. However, the governor's race was unexpectedly very close. But, however, New Jersey's probably going to go to Harris by around 12 to 14 points. Consistently polled in the high single digits there. So, again, New Jersey is a safe state for Harris. We haven't had any recent Connecticut polling, but that is a safe Democrat state for Joe Biden. We also don't have any Delaware polling. So, yeah, that's going to be another blue state. Now let's go to arguably one of the most important states in the election, Pennsylvania. In a recent poll, it has Harris up by 2, making it a tilt state, with RFK Jr. grabbing 4% of the vote. I think at this point, Pennsylvania is a toss-up state, so whichever direction goes in, I don't think we can argue. Now let's go to New York, where Harris is up by 12, with RFK Jr. snagging 7% of the vote. Of course, New York is a safe state. Let's go to another interesting state, Virginia. Has recently been in play for Republicans, but they are probably not going to win the state. But in the most recent poll, they have Trump and Harris in a matchup, with Trump actually winning it by 4 points and RFK snagging 5% of the vote. Until we get some high-quality polling out of Virginia, I'm just going to put it as a lean Democratic state. Now let's go to North Carolina, where a recent poll shows Trump up by 4. That is a lean state for him. Also shows RFK Jr. sagging 3% of the vote there, so not really impactful in a key battleground state. Now let's go to South Carolina. There hasn't been any recent polling in there, but we know it's going to be a safe state for Trump. Let's go to another very important state, Georgia. Joe Biden won Georgia by the narrowest of margins, and the Atlanta suburbs continue to show support for Joe Biden. Harris doing marginally better than black voters. That may be enough to make Georgia blue again. However, many polls disagree with this conspiracy theory as they have Trump up by single digits. In the most recent poll, Trump is up by 2% in Georgia, making it a tilt state, with RFK Jr. grabbing 3% of the vote, so not very impactful. Now let's go to Florida, where they have Trump up by 6%, with RFK Jr. snagging 5% of the vote. This is a likely state for him. Now let's go to Alabama. We haven't had any recent polling there, but we know that's a safe state. The same can be said for Mississippi. We also know that that's a safe state. Now let's go to Tennessee, where RFK Jr. is consistently polling high single digits, but we haven't had any Harris matchup, but we know that is a Republican state. Now let's go to West Virginia. We all know that is a safe state, and also Kentucky is a safe state too. Now let's go to a somewhat competitive state, Ohio. The most recent poll has Trump up by 9, with Kennedy grabbing a surprising 10% of the vote, but this is still a likely state for Trump. Now let's go to one of the most important battleground states, Michigan. In recent polls, they have consistently showed Harris up by margins of 2, 5, and 1. New York Times CNN has Harris up by 5, with RFK Jr. grabbing 4% of the vote. Michigan is a lean state. However, in terms of the polling it is, but I think it's going to be a tilt state. Now let's go to Wisconsin, another very important state. The most recent poll we had, including RFK Jr., has Harris up by 6%, and another one has her up by 7%, with RFK in mid-single digits. This is a likely state, which makes no sense. So I'm just going to put it, again, as a tilt state. Let's go to Illinois. We all know that's going to be a safe blue state. There hasn't been any recent polling out of there, but we all know it's a safe blue state. Go to Indiana. We haven't had any polling out there too, but it's a safe red state. Now let's go to a somewhat competitive state, Minnesota. As a recent poll has Harris up by 5, with RFK Jr. snagging 4% of the vote. This is a lean state. Harris up by 5 is a very realistic margin. If it's like this on election day, that could tell us a lot, and it's probably going to be a very close election. Nobody's polling the Dakota, so we can just put those as red and red. Now let's go to Nebraska. The only interesting thing about this is Nebraska's CD2 district. Again, I talked about it on the tie. I still think it's going to go to Harris by a couple of points. But RFK Jr. has been polling pretty good. They're at around 7%. But we all know Nebraska at large, as well as his third and first district, is safe for Trump. However, I'm just going to give the nod to Joe Biden. I'm sorry, I said Joe Biden. I'm just going to give the nod to Kamala Harris, as she's going to win it probably by around 4 points. We haven't had any polling out of Kansas, but as we know, it's a safe red state. We haven't also had any polling with Harris in Oklahoma, but we know that's a safe state. Now let's go to Texas, an actually interesting state, up by 8 points with Harris, with RFK Jr. snagging 5% of the vote. That is a likely state. Talked about how Texas went a bit more left in the 2020 election. However, Trump's probably going to improve on that margin, and I am not going to be surprised if the result is closer to 2016 than it was to 2020. Now let's go to Iowa. We haven't had any Harris polling out of it, but Trump's obviously going to likely win it. But RFK Jr. has been polling pretty good there with around 10% of the vote. Let's check the score. Trump 207, Harris 177, and RFK Jr. has yet to win a state. Consistently, RFK Jr. has averaged around the high single digits, so that has some type of impact. However, he has not had a ginormous impact in battleground states yet. Now let's go to Missouri, where obviously Trump's up by 15, safe state, but Kennedy's polling at 7%. Very consistent with his previous polling numbers. And nobody's polling Arkansas, and Louisiana, but those are safe red states. I know most of those were safe states or likely states, and most of them didn't have RFK Jr. polling with Harris, but it's good to see how RFK stacks up with those. In Colorado, Joe Biden, unsurprisingly, is up by 8 points, with RFK Jr. actually snagging a very good amount, 12%. This is a safe state. Let's go to New Mexico, where Kamala Harris is polling up by 7 points. That is a respectable margin. And also RFK Jr. grabbing 8% of the vote. Mexico is a likely state. We can also put Hawaii and Alaska as safe Democrat and Republican state. Now let's go to another very important state, Arizona. The average has them tied, but a recent poll has Trump up by 1, with RFK Jr. snagging 3% of the vote. This is a tilt state. Now let's go to Utah. Unsurprisingly, Trump up by 29, but RFK Jr. actually pulled 13% there, which is very good. So that is a safe state for him. Now let's go to my favorite battleground state, Nevada. As you guys know, people have been talking about Nevada and its potential turn to go Republican again. In recent polls, they have Trump up by 3 and tied with Harris, as RFK Jr. grabs 5% of the vote. This is a tilt state. Now let's go to California, where in California, Harris is up by 24, with RFK Jr. grabbing 5% of the vote, safe state. We haven't had any polls out of Oregon, surprisingly, and in Washington, Harris is up by 14 points, with RFK Jr. grabbing 6% of the vote. This is a also safe state for Democrats. We also don't have any recent polling out of Idaho, but we know that's a safe state. We also haven't had any polling out of Wyoming, so that's also a safe state. Montana, Trump is up by 15, with RFK Jr. snagging 5% of the vote. That is a safe state. And that is it. Harris 270, Trump 268. So it shows that RFK Jr. actually doesn't have an impact when it comes to Harris, but when it came to Joe Biden, it actually helped Trump more, which is kind of interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.